Stephen Roy Goodman, host of Higher Education Today, a production of the University of the District of Columbia. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today, we'll be talking about the U.S. News College Rankings. Robert Morris is Director of Data Research for U.S. News & World Report. Bob develops the methodologies and surveys for the best colleges and best graduate schools annual rankings. Ann Weeks is upper school head of the Salisbury School in Maryland. Ann has also been upper school director at Agnes Irwin and dean of academic life at Oldfield School. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, thanks for coming on. Bob, maybe if we could start with you. What are the rankings and how did they start and what do they measure?
Well, the rankings started in 1983 and they were much less elaborate than they are today, and it was before the internet, so they were obviously weren't as accessible as they are today. And we're doing them for the same purpose back then as we are now, which was to provide information for consumers, and our main audience is prospective students and their parents. So that's who we're doing it for, and our intent is to just provide them with one tool to use in admissions and not to be the sole factor. And they're obviously become fairly prominent and visible since then.
So in your mind, they're a consumer tool?
Yeah, that's our intent is them to be a consumer tool. We're certainly totally aware that the higher education community is engaged with us and discusses the rankings, and the rankings are having an impact on them in various ways, but they're not the main audience. It's prospective students and their parents.
Well, and you raise an interesting question about this in the terms of the higher education community, and as someone who's been in the higher education community for a long time, and there is a lot of discussion about the rankings and whether or not the rankings rank colleges like we would rank a car or something else. And Ann, from your perspective, you've worked in a number of schools. Do your students look at colleges like they look at cars, like they look at other consumer goods, and how do they use the rankings?
Well, I think, at least for the independent schools, I would agree with what Bob's saying, that it's one tool in the toolbox. I think what's fortunate in independent schools is that we have college counselors that's really their sole job. And so from actually as early as 7th and 8th grade, families are being educated in how to use the various tools that the media produces in making their decisions. So I think they tend to develop a more balanced view of, say, the weight of the rankings overall in the process. I'm not so sure that that's the case with the public sector that might not be getting that sort of focused guidance, because I know in the public schools, guidance counselors have many, many things on their plate, and college guidance isn't the sole focus. I do see a change in the past, say, 3 to 4 years, where students are actually driving the decision process more than their parents. I do wonder if some of that is due to the accessibility of information on the internet. You find students doing research earlier on their own, but I also think it's partly this parent generation that they're a little different in their parenting. They're not quite as willing to demand that their child do this or that, and are much more willing to listen to what their child thinks and wants and to defer to that. So I do wonder if the impact of the rankings might change somewhat as a result of that with this generation of students.
Well, Bob, do you see that? And you've been around the block once or twice in terms of generations, in terms of being involved in the rankings. So do you see the shift in terms of what Ann is talking about?
Well, I'm not as close to the individual students as Ann is, but I definitely agree on one of her points that there's a big difference between at public schools, and I would say that arguably what U.S. News has done is filled an information void, that more and more parents at public schools have had to do it themselves because of these loads. Our country has cut high school counseling at public schools. It's a number of counselors, or they've kept the counselors the same, and enrollment meant that their per student load has gone up and they've taken on other jobs, so they just can't spend as much time for each student. So parents have had to try to do it themselves, or the students. So they're not getting old-fashioned counseling like you get at independent schools. I think students are used to using the internet and be getting more sophisticated and figuring things out themselves, and so I think they're probably more involved than they used to be.
Well, in terms of what they're involved with, when a student reads U.S. News and World Report rankings, what do you want them to look at? Do you want them to look at the quality of the academic program? Do you want them to look at the academic resources or the financial resources of the institution? Do you want them to get a sense of what their future job prospects are going to be?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of different levels of it. I think there's definitely some students and parents who are just looking at the overall rank and are thinking, I want to go to schools, and these are good schools. We're hoping they're going to be more sophisticated than that, and they're going to use the data and that's linked in with the rankings as a way of guiding them into their decision. If they think admissions is important, they can use the data to see how they fall into a specific school, if the graduation or retention rate, so they can use the data to help them focus on what's important to them. I think one thing our rankings do, even though it's typically not talked about, is because we do all these different kinds of rankings, that we're not just focused on the elite schools, even though the elite schools got a lot of attention. I think we've raised the awareness and visibility of regional universities and regional colleges where the top students don't go, but are good choices for average students who don't have the credentials to get into top schools. So I think there's lots there to look at. In fact, probably the information on our website is probably overwhelming to a typical student and parents. So that in and of itself is we just let people go at it.
Well, let's try to simplify this a little bit,
right,
if we could. What would happen if I was an average high school student and I was interested in studying economics, and I want to get some information? And let's say I go to your school, Ann, you would counsel me, and how would you advise me, one, and then Bob, what would you like me to look at on the U.S. News website in terms of getting information about that economics department?
Well, I think in the independent schools, it's an interesting question to answer, because advising just for a school with economics is probably not what you would do. Mm-hmm. You would begin with what the student's personality type is, their learning profile. You would talk with them about their interests outside of academics, and you would really look for a community that would be a good fit for them. And then, obviously, pay attention to what it is they might want to major in. And of course, in the back of our minds, we always realize that a student who is in 11th grade says that they want to study economics, but it's probably more than likely that that isn't what they'll end up majoring in. So you have to keep that in mind as well, and really develop a profile that would suggest, for instance, I might get a sense that they enjoy history, or maybe they're also a musician, and try to find a school that would allow some flexibility in what they would eventually do. So to actually look specifically for economics would probably not be the main focus. The one thing I would say, though, with teenagers now, what I find is that they're actually discovering information about schools in ways we never would have thought of. For instance, through Facebook. You know, they will explore photos of what students are doing at different schools. An example I might give is I had a young lady years ago who was trying to decide between a college outside of Boston and one in Atlanta. And ultimately, she made her decision based on the photos she saw posted on a social network in terms of what those students were doing in their free time. And she actually ended up choosing the school in Atlanta because those students were engaged in the community Whereas the school in Boston, they were all in rooms partying. And she knew that the Atlanta school fit what she was looking for beyond academics, that it was a better fit for her. And who would have thought that they would be that sophisticated? I had a student who actually found a blog that a student was keeping at College of Worcester about his biology major. And she read his blog, and that's what caused her to choose College of Worcester, because she was so interested in the connections he had with his professor and the research that he was able to do. So some of the deciding factors are coming from information sources that we're not producing.
Right.
Fair point.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of what U.S. News can offer, I think U.S. News doesn't really have evaluative information on majors. We do have rankings on undergraduate business and undergraduate engineering, which are two of the biggest majors or among the two biggest. So we do have evaluative information in terms of specific. In terms of economics, we could really only offer that you could search by major on our site, and then you could link that into a ranking. If you had the credentials to get into a top school, then you could see which of the top schools has economics, which almost all of them do. And if you're really sophisticated, you could use our graduate school rankings, and you could see which of the top ranked PhD programs in economics, and it's probably a fair assumption to say those, even though it's delivered differently, the top ranked, the schools that have a top ranked graduate program are likely to have, there's some overlap in the faculty, are likely to have a pretty rigorous and broad-based economics department. So there are ways to sort of use our graduate rankings to inform your undergraduate decision, but that's how you could use the data on our site.
Interesting. Well, Anne, if we can get to the point that you just raised a second ago about a student who changes his or her mind. As someone who's a college counselor and has been for a long time, I mean, I agree with you on that, and a lot of my students say they want to do one thing and then end up majoring in something else when they get to college.
Right.
But the problem is that when we're starting the college search process, students don't know where they want to go, and we have to go somewhere, right? You can't apply to 3,000 colleges.
Right.
So it's somehow we need to figure out how to kind of narrow this down. So how do you think a family ought to be using, and a student ought to be using the rankings? Because this is really about the U.S. News rankings, and a lot of people like the rankings, a lot of people don't like the rankings. But how do you want your students to look at it? Do you want a student to say, well, I know I may change my major, but this school is in the top 10. Or this school isn't in the top 10, but it has a good social life vis-a-vis XYZ, or we can be involved in the community in some way. How do you want students to use the ranking?
Well, I think it's important for them to read the rankings, and I think it helps them narrow down schools that they're interested in. But again, I would say that I'd want to balance it. So for instance, I might say to them, well, let's say they want to look in the Midwest as an example. And going back to what Bob said earlier, not always knowing those regional schools, especially if you're from the East Coast. The rankings are going to help you figure out which schools out there have a better reputation, that are regional schools that basically are recognizable. And they're probably going to be recognizable because they have good academic programs and their graduates have done well. So it's a stepping off point. I would then say, go to the Yale Insider's Guide. Read a little bit about that and see how does that match what you're seeing in the rankings. Visit the campus, talk with alums, all sorts of things, again, that you would pull into to make that informed decision. But I do think the rankings, for instance, as a college counselor, if I were to mention my alma mater, which was Lawrence University, to someone in the DC area, they'd probably say, Sarah Lawrence? St. Lawrence? You know, they might not know Lawrence University, but I could turn to the rankings and say, here's a good, solid liberal arts college that's a regional college in the Midwest. Maybe you should take a look at it. If you want to major in physics, for instance, they have an amazing physics program. It might be a way to get a family to look at a school that they normally would not have heard of and would be reticent to even think about. So as a counselor, I sometimes think that those rankings can be a segue into maybe broadening their search some.
And Bob, in terms of taking that student who is going to search into something else or to a new school or a new set of schools, can you speak to what exactly are you measuring in the rankings?
Well, we are measuring a lot of different things. I mean, the rankings obviously don't cover everything that goes on at a school, so they're limited in the sense that there's a lot of what goes on in the school, some of what we're talking about, the environment or activities or the breadth of activities, can't be measured. So we are, I'll say, limited to what can be measured, but we are looking at the reputation of a school, how selective it is, how hard it is to get into. We have a bunch of indicators on faculty, class sizes, and student-teacher ratios, and faculty credentials. We're also looking at graduation and retention rates. So how successful a school is at graduating their students and keeping them, retaining them from freshman to sophomore. We're looking at financial resources, sort of how strong is a school, sort of financial resources going to education, and we're also looking at alumni giving, so to the students, not how much, but do the students care enough to give back to the school after they've graduated, sort of as a very loose measure of alumni satisfaction. So we have a broad range of indicators. They tend to be really focused on measuring the student experience, either reputation or sort of what goes on at the school, and some of them are output measures, so they're a combination of input and output measures.
And I actually think two of those are really important. The retention rate is something that I always tell parents to pay attention to, and I agree with you with the alumni giving. I think that says a lot in terms of the commitment they have after they've graduated.
Well, in terms of the alumni giving, though, I mean, what's to prevent a school from saying, giving out some prizes to people and saying everybody just gives $5 to make sure that the alumni giving rate goes up?
Well, there's nothing to prevent schools from doing that, but I tend to think that it happens very, very rarely. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I think most schools are trying to be more productive in their fundraising and view it as actual fundraising than as mainly a rankings boosting activity. However, it is one of the uses of the rankings, which I didn't mention earlier. So the alumni fundraising, they do use rankings as either saying it'll help you in your rankings or as a validation. Your school is good, U.S. News says so, help support it so we can maintain this level of academic in the academic world, and we need your money to reach that goal.
And I may be overestimating the sophistication of alums, but I would think that most alums understand that no matter what their level of giving is, whether it be $5 or $5,000, that the higher the percentage of giving at a school, the better their chances of winning grants and awards. And so even if you're giving $5, you know that you're investing in the future of the school in terms of the academic program. So, and as I said, maybe I'm overestimating people's knowledge of that, but I'm not so sure that just giving $5 a year is necessarily a throwaway, that it actually can be an investment.
I think that's a fair point. But I was trying to get to the issue of how do we know that the input that you're getting from the schools is accurate? And that was interesting to me.
No, I mean, it's obviously a big question, and it's an important question. I mean, I think broadly speaking, the schools are honest, and they care about the data integrity because the image of the school, and in most cases, a lot of the data U.S. News is asking for, not all of it, but a meaningful proportion of it is reported to other external sources. So it's not that a school is just lying to U.S. News or falsifying data to U.S. News. I mean, there's certainly been in 2012, there was this week with George Washington, or last week, but there's been Claremont McKenna and Emory and Iona College. So there's been a few really high profile cases of data falsification, or at least mega misreporting, whatever we want to call it. But I think those are the exceptions. I mean, that's also something new. These disclosures by the schools. I mean, you can argue it one way, that the fact that they're coming forward and going through the embarrassment and their image is sort of at least slammed for an unknown period of time, that they care enough about the long run data integrity to sort of get this behind them and sort of go through the pain of these public disclosures. So I think actually that says a lot about how much they actually care about data integrity. We think the misreporting and falsifications are the exceptions, a very small percent of schools and a very small percent of the data.
Well, but in terms of that point, do college presidents call you up and say, I happen to be in Washington and I'd like to go to lunch with you?
Well, yeah, they would probably have their public relations people do it, but effectively, on a regular basis, we meet with schools on ranking questions. Either, we do so many rankings, but yes, on a regular basis, we meet with higher ed colleges or law school deans or business school deans or admission people to talk about various aspects of the rankings. So that's, yes.
Fair enough. And Anne, in terms of your schools, you've worked with some very nice independent schools over the years. How do we know that they're very nice? Do we know that they're very nice because kids get into good colleges from there, or do we know that they're very nice because students are learning a lot? How do we know?
What I would tell you, and I think people who have worked internally in independent schools would probably agree with this, that really the way to judge an independent school is to see how the student is doing once they're out of college, and how they're navigating the career world. Because I often think, well, let me go back. Sometimes you'll have a parent say senior year, when their child is all said and done with applying to college, and maybe they didn't get into Yale or Princeton, but got into what they consider a second-tier school. And the parent says, oh, I invested all this money in a private education, and they got into a school that they could have gotten into if they'd gone to the local public school. And some guidance counselors are quaking their shoes when they're asked that. And my response to that is that really what you're buying in, and you are a consumer, when you're buying a private school education, is more learning the skills to be an effective adult eventually in the working world. It's not so much where you go to college, it's the skills you've learned in high school. And as an independent school parent, as Bob is as well, and I'm sure you can attest to this, the skills that I see in my own child now and his success in what he does, and he's a fundraiser, so he's out there every day, are skills he learned at his independent school. They're not the skills he learned in college. I can see that in terms of knowing how to network, knowing how to present himself. He went to high school wearing a jacket and tie. He's comfortable. He, because he was in smaller classes and developed close relationships with his faculty, certainly intellectually he was challenged on a daily basis, and I think challenged to his independent strengths and weaknesses. Whereas we were talking earlier, in a large public school, that's not always the case because just the pure volume of students that they're dealing with every day. So I feel as though the investment really is more in what they're learning day to day rather than the actual college they get into. Now, to balance that, I would say, with the highly prestigious independent schools, obviously parents they have that expectation of getting into a highly competitive college. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. We all know with Harvard, as they say, if they used a lottery, they could fill their class with students who are just as capable as the ones that they choose. through their admission process.
Fair enough. We only have a minute or two left. Where do you see the rankings going in the future? Bob, where do you see the rankings going in the future? Hopefully we'll have time for 2 comments, but if not, Anne, where would you like the rankings to go?
Okay, well, I think the rankings are here to stay. They're not going away. The internet has become, the access of information has spread them globally. I think that's proof by the U.S. News rankings have become the main source of information in East Asia. Chinese are sending large numbers of students to the U.S. So I think we're going to keep doing them, maybe broaden them out into other areas, and make them more sophisticated and use the interactivity tools on the internet so people can use the data in different ways than they do now.
I think they're here to stay. I think they're a valuable tool. We could do a whole nother show on what Bob just talked about and how the international families use them. They don't use them balanced with other information, and that's something we as private schools, as we admit international students, are going to have to work on with those families.
Well, fair enough. Thank you both for coming on the show today. As you both know, rankings are very important to students who are applying to colleges and universities, both from the private sector and the public sector. I think we're going to be, as someone who's a college advisor, I'm going to be relying on rankings for many years to come. So thank you both for taking the time to come today.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
If you would like additional information about Robert Morse or Anne Weeks, please visit usnews.com/rankings or thesalisburyschool.org. If you have comments or suggestions about higher education today, please send an email to our viewer mailbox at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Stephen Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.